The following is an OPB original series.
Oregon Experience is a production of OPB in partnership with the Oregon Historical Society. Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, and the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Charitable Trust Fund for Lifelong Learning. Major support provided by the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by John and Nancy Deckard and the contributing members of OPB and viewers like you. Thank you.
Throughout much of Oregon's early history, there were exclusion laws banning blacks from coming to Oregon.
You could not be black in Oregon, or if you were here, you couldn't stay. And yet, slaves were actually brought here.
The entire Northwest was created to be a racist white utopia. And yet, black folks, in the face of that, created communities even when it meant risking their lives.
They were standing up and saying, you can't do this kind of thing to me.
A lot of folk paid a hefty price for me to have the opportunities that I have. Let their stories be heard.
In August of 1788, the merchant ship the Lady Washington set anchor at Tillamook Bay, where the ship's crew traded with local tribes. When a dispute broke out, a black sailor named Marcus Lopez was killed.
They drenched their knives and spears with savage fury in the body of the unfortunate youth. He fell within 15 yards of me and instantly expired. Robert Haswell, 1788.
Marcus Lopez is the first documented person of African descent in Oregon.
We know what that year was, we know the man's name, we know where he came from, what work he did. And during that time, there were multi-racial ships along the Oregon-California coast from all over the world. And these men weren't slaves, they were workers.
Gwen Carr worked to have Lopez's name added to this historical marker near Tillamook, commemorating the ship's arrival.
This was a black person in Oregon in 1788. And so I made it my business to find out how does one get that sign changed. I think it was important for black people and white people alike because most people don't know that black history in Oregon goes back that far.
The Oregon Black Pioneers is an all-volunteer organization dedicated to researching, preserving, and sharing the largely unknown history of the state's early black residents.
Well, this is a stone commemorating Hiram Gorman, who they called High. And this is not actually his original resting place, but it's here somewhere.
We're next to the monument that Oregon Black Pioneers placed here in 2007 in order to honor the African Americans and the black people that are buried here. We've tried to educate Oregonians about this wonderful, rich, and largely unknown history of African Americans' contributions to this state and its development.
The number of African American residents in Oregon has historically been low. For decades, less than 2% of the overall population.
As a person coming out of the South and coming into this place called Oregon, when I first got here 40 years ago, on a daily basis, the only other person that I saw that looked like me, or only other persons, were my family, my children, and my sisters. Even on the job that I went to, That's a frightening kind of thing.
Portland was considered to be the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line, and some Black leaders called it Up South. So Black life was incredibly curtailed, contained, and exploited here because Black folks were never supposed to be here.
So you had a great deal of anti-Black history in Oregon. Joseph Lane, first territorial governor of Oregon, was very sympathetic to slavery. He ran for vice president on a slave state ticket against Abraham Lincoln in 1860.
The region's earliest white settlers banned Black slavery, but for decades, there were still some slaves here.
And it turns out that almost every early wagon train had at least a few slaves on the wagon train. But nobody kept that story. Nobody was keeping the history of Blacks in Oregon.
Until 1865, nearly half of the U.S. states legally enslaved African Americans. For hundreds of years, millions of Black men, women, and children were bought and sold. Even their names were not their own. They could change with each owner. And often, the identities of slaves and free Blacks were left out of official documents.
You'll see references to them, the little Black girl, or the yellow girl, or the servant girl. You see all these references, but no names. I feel like we're bringing them to life. It lets the world know that they existed. You know, otherwise they're invisible.
The stories of Oregon's early white pioneers are well documented, but the lives of people of color were routinely left out of history books. Though it is known there were Black mountain men, sailors, and settlers throughout the region, there are very few identified images from the mid-1800s. For researchers and genealogists, tracking down those early individuals can be nearly impossible. Bob Zyback and Janet Miranda have spent nearly 30 years uncovering the story of early Black resident Letitia Carson.
There's her ex. Leticia Carson, that's her ex.
There are no known public photographs of Letitia Carson. But this image of a woman about the same age from the time period illustrates what she might have looked like. She was in her 30s when she traveled from Missouri with the white man David Carson.
When they left in May of 1845 on the Oregon Trail, she was already 8 months pregnant.
With a new baby, they endured the 2,000-mile trip and settled in what is now Benton County.
Coming across on the trail, nobody wrote about her. You knew that she was with the wagon train, but she was not identified. Nobody ever talked about her having a baby.
For decades, this was how wagon train pioneers were portrayed, as white settlers looking for a new life. But that was never the whole story.
You had people who had come over the Oregon Trail or who were living in various parts of Oregon, one or two here, one or two families there. Of the 36 counties in Oregon, we've identified at least the presence of Blacks in almost all of them right now. And most of those happened prior to the 1900s.
Blacks have been coming to and in Oregon for a very long time, and a very long time before the American wagon trains began to arrive in the 19th century as well.
Most famously, the slave York, who arrived in Oregon country with Lewis and Clark in 1805.
Wherever there was a frontier, you were going to have tremendous contact between different racial and cultural groups. And what that meant was that people of color often came to play prominent parts, prominent roles, and that was certainly true in the Pacific Northwest.
In the early 1800s, much of the Pacific Northwest was known as Oregon country and jointly occupied by different nations. Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River was the epicenter. It was the regional headquarters of the British-owned Hudson's Bay Company. The company employed and traded with people from all over the globe, including black fur trappers, explorers, and sailors.
One of the most powerful individuals in the Hudson Bay Company in the Pacific Northwest. His name is James Douglas.
Douglas was mixed race, born in Guyana. His father was Scottish and his mother was a free woman of color. At that time, if a person had any known African ancestors, they were considered black, no matter what color their skin was. In the United States, that would have limited Douglas's opportunities. But in British-occupied areas of Oregon country, it didn't matter as much. Douglas would spend 20 years at Fort Vancouver and go on to become governor of both Vancouver Island and British Columbia.
The things in Oregon and in Washington and the American experience that we name after Lewis and Clark, in Canada, they named after James Douglas, a man of color.
In Southern Oregon, some blacks found opportunities with the gold rush. Nellie Matthews and her adult children arrived in Jacksonville in the early 1850s, shortly after gold was discovered. In the mining boomtown, they found plenty of work and eventually settled into the region as farmers. While Lewis Southworth traveled the gold camps of Northern California and Southern Oregon, even though he was a slave.
His owner said, well, you have to buy your freedom. You have to pay me for your value.
And he went down to the gold mines and he made a lot of money. Some say as a prospector, but others say by fiddling.
And so he made enough money to pay $1,000 to his owner for his freedom.
He was wounded in the Rogue Indian Wars, reportedly as the first African American in the Oregon militia.
He operated a livery stable in Polk County, eventually went down to the Oregon coast where he operated a ferry. Originally there was a creek named for him in not a very complimentary way, which is now named Southworth Creek to honor him. That's on the coast. And so he became another prominent black in Oregon.
Throughout the mid-1800s, Oregon's future was being decided in Washington, D.C., including the passage of land laws designed to lure white settlers west.
Under the Donation Land Act, if you came to Oregon and settled, then that land would be given to you absolutely free by the government. The only qualification that you really had to display to get that free land was you had to be white, or you had to have a father who was white.
From the 1830s to the 1860s, it's estimated some 400,000 settlers traveled the Oregon Trail, displacing the native people, claiming land, and creating their own laws and governments.
1843 was the big wagon train that came out called the Great Migration. And they brought about 1,000 white settlers on that wagon train from Missouri, which more than doubled the existing white population in that period. And that was led in part by Peter Burnett, who later became a governor of California. He had this fantasy, and it could only be that the West would be preserved for whites. He didn't want blacks here.
Gregory Noakes has written books on both Peter Burnett and slavery in Oregon after discovering his own family's history as slave owners.
My grandparents had written about Robert Shipley, an ancestor who brought a slave, Ruben Shipley, out from Missouri to Oregon and settled in Benton County. Ruben Shipley was given his freedom, became a fairly successful farmer down in Benton County, had 100 acres of land and his own farm.
In 1861, Ruben Shipley donated part of his farmland to establish Mount Union Cemetery, open to both blacks and whites. His wife, Mary Jane, had arrived in Oregon as a slave, and Ruben had to pay her former owner in order to marry her. In 1924, the Oregonian reported on her 100th birthday.
I had no idea there had ever been black slaves in Oregon, no idea that the family had any involvement with slavery. Not happy to hear this, but it was a story worth pursuing. I discovered throughout much of Oregon's early history there were exclusion laws banning blacks from coming to Oregon, and all sorts of discriminatory legislation against blacks.
In 1844, before Oregon became a state, Peter Burnett and other early leaders in the provisional government passed the first of several exclusion laws, banning both slavery and free blacks from coming to the region, even though some of those same leaders brought slaves with them to help set up their farms.
Slaveholders had 3 years to free their slaves, and so that meant there was a 3-year window of slavery would be lawful. And then the slaves were then obligated to leave Oregon or be subject to a severe lashing, which became known as Peter Burnett's Lash Law.
If such free Negro or mulatto shall fail to quit the country, he or she may be arrested and shall receive upon his or her bare back not less than 20, no more than 39 stripes.
Within months, new territorial leaders removed the Lash Law. It's never known to have been enforced.
And so you had this conflict between the pro-slavery people and the anti-slavery people. So that was kind of the raging debate going on here, and then it fit into this national story of would slavery be extended out from the slave states.
In 1851, the exclusion law was used against Jacob Vanderpool, a sailor from the West Indies who operated a saloon and boarding house in Oregon City.
Oh, here it is. The statute should be immediately enforced and that the Negro should be banished forthwith from the territory. So the judge is saying, we've got a law. So you brought him, so let's uphold the law.
In Portland, there were also efforts to remove the Francis family that operated this store in 1851.
Their white neighbors came to their aid and signed petitions to have exceptions made.
Nobody did that for Jacob Vanderbilt.
So he got kicked out.
So he got kicked
He
out.
got kicked out.
He needed some friends. Some white friends.
They were in short order at that point.
Oregon's early black population was small, estimated by scholars at less than 60 known residents in 1850.
I would imagine that there were slaves who were brought here who didn't know that this was a free territory. They were coming with their master, and that's the way life was for them.
The End of the Oregon Trail Museum includes an exhibit on Rose Jackson, who traveled to Oregon in 1849 with Dr. William Allen and his family.
We call her the woman in the box. They drilled holes in the box and brought her over the Oregon Trail.
It's said that because of the ban against blacks, she hid in a box during the day and came out at night.
Just kind of sounds unbelievable, but the source of that story is really the diary of her owner. So you can't really argue with that.
You also had free blacks who came into Oregon, some that stayed and some that went on and moved on to what is now Washington.
In 1844, George Washington Bush led his family and several others over the Oregon Trail, just as early leaders in the region were banning blacks.
He told me he would watch when we got to Oregon, and if he could not have a free man's rights, he would seek protection elsewhere.
Bush stayed the winter with the Hudson's Bay Company and settled in what is now Bush Prairie near Tumwater. His son would be Washington's first African-American legislator, while the similarly named George Washington also went north.
So he was able to get a piece of land, and he was able later to turn that piece of land into the city we know as Centralia. He was the founder of Centralia. If you were a black person, in spite of the exclusion laws, in spite of the Donation Land Act law, if you were in an area in which your neighbors accepted you, tolerated you, were willing to interact with you in an acceptable way, then you could still live here and even prosper here.
That was the case with mother and daughter Hanna and Eliza Gorman, who lived and worked out of this Corvallis home. The Gorman House is thought to be Oregon's oldest standing residence built by African American pioneers. Today, it is being restored and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places.
So this is the very oldest part of the house, and with the fireplace, this is obviously would have been the place where maybe most of the cooking would have taken place.
Eliza was a talented seamstress, and both women took in laundry to pay the bills.
The archaeological work that we're finding out in the yard, there are hundreds of buttons in the soil. So a lot of people who had their laundry done here in Corvallis ended up minus a button or two, in their shirts.
Like many others in the time period, the Gormans were freed after coming to Oregon as slaves. When Eliza died in 1869, the local newspaper ran a glowing obituary.
She will be missed by nearly every family in Corvallis. Corvallis Gazette, 1869.
A lot of them were promised that if they came with the family over the Oregon Trail, for example, to Oregon, they would be freed.
A good example of that is the Holmes family. The Holmes family was offered freedom if they came with the Nathaniel Ford family to Oregon. And yet when they got here, only part of the family was freed. And the man and his wife ended up suing for their freedom.
Ford had kept most of the children as slaves. The case dragged on for over a year before the Holmes finally won their children's freedom.
Inasmuch as these colored children are in Oregon, where slavery does not legally exist, they are free.
I think that Robin Holmes is probably an heroic figure in Oregon. He managed to prevail in that suit, the only slavery trial ever held in Oregon. But as a result of that case, the legislature very quickly did pass a law banning blacks from testifying against whites.
But blacks still found ways to demand their rights.
This is the record of Leticia Carson versus Greenberry Smith.
The lawsuit involved the land claim of David Carson, who settled 320 acres near Corvallis with Letitia Carson and their 2 children.
From all the evidence at hand, it would appear that David Carson was both Letitia's owner, master, and husband, the father of her mulatto daughter and son.
Today, Oregon State University owns and operates the property as a cattle ranch. Almost nothing remains of the Carson homestead, though there are clues to what was once here.
See that cut right through there?
Like into the trees there?
Yeah, but see where there's kind of an opening in the canopy there?
Yep.
That might be it. That'd be about the right spot. They raised bacon, potatoes, orchards. I think she was the person who did the work.
When David died in 1852, Letitia and their children were immediately kicked out of their home by wealthy neighbor Greenberry Smith.
He claimed to be the executor of David Carson's will. Nobody knew how that happened. He was a racist. He believed that Leticia Carson was property.
And he told her, you will inherit nothing. If you were still in Missouri, I could sell you and your children in a heartbeat.
They took all the property, including Letitia's cooking equipment and bedding, his underwear, everything, and sold it at a public auction.
The auction records indicate that Letitia was forced to buy back some of her own essentials. She moved with friends to Douglas County and filed a lawsuit against Greenberry Smith.
A young lawyer who had just moved into the Oregon area from California, named Andrew Thayer, somehow met her, and he agreed that he would represent her in court.
They argued that if she wasn't Carson's wife, then she must have been his employee and was entitled to back wages. A jury of all white men awarded her over $500, which included court fees. Then she sued again for the loss of her livestock.
Once again, the jury of the 12 men said, you're right. He needs to pay her There were orders from the judge to the sheriff to go and collect the money.
But the case was unusual. Legally, blacks had almost no rights. In 1857, Oregonians voted to officially ban slavery, but also to exclude blacks from settling in the region. 2 years later, in 1859, Oregon was the only free state admitted to the Union with an exclusion law in its constitution.
No free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall come, reside, or be within this state.
It says a lot about the racism in the history of Oregon. You had governors all along, senators who were pro-slavery, and then the fact that you had the Constitution with an exclusion clause in it. I mean, you have to have public support for these things. I mean, the public had to be buying into these.
Oregon's exclusion clause stayed in the state constitution until 1926. The original racist language remained in the Constitution until voters removed it in 2002.
It basically served as a flashing neon light at Oregon's border saying, go south, go north, but don't come here. And black folks, by and large, got that message loud and clear.
And yet, despite the hardships, some early black residents were determined to settle and stay. In 1862, President Lincoln enacted the Homestead Act, which provided cheap Western lands to settlers, including freed slaves and widows. Within months, Letitia Carson filed a claim for land in Douglas County.
There's been 3 million or more people on the Homestead Act, but she was one of the very first to file a homestead claim.
And it lists her as one of 7 women in Oregon, the only one of color.
She listed herself not as a freed slave, but as a widow.
It tells you a lot about what she thought about her situation and about herself.
Leticia Carson lived the rest of her life on her own land in Douglas County. Her son continued to live in the region. Her daughter married a Native American and moved to the Pendleton area, where her descendants still live today.
But she had the courage to challenge the system, and she eventually won. And so I see a woman that's determined, that persevered, that she was going to take care of herself no matter what, and she did.
She's another case of a black person in Oregon's history who's been virtually ignored and really needs to be honored for things that she has done to make Oregon a better place.
Oregon has really tried to forget, and yet we can't begin to understand this place that we live without this information.
When I talk about this kind of history with audiences today, first of all, they're shocked, they're sometimes angry about it, and almost always they want me to tell them what to do. I can tell them what happened, but I can't tell them what to do.
That history has already happened. You can't change it. The best thing that you can do is really tell the truth about it and acknowledge it and move on and say, we know this was wrong, and we're going to work to see if this never happens again.
There's more about Oregon's Black pioneers on Oregon Experience online. To learn more, visit opb.org. Leading support for Oregon Experience is provided by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation, Arlene Schnitzer and Jordan Schnitzer, and the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Charitable Trust Fund for Lifelong Learning. Major support provided by the Clark Foundation. Additional support provided by John and Nancy Deckard and the contributing members of OPB and viewers like you. Thank you.